Welcome to the Aspen Institute's Hurst Lecture Series event featuring Dr. Laurie Santos in conversation with Carl Zimmer. I'm Crystal Logan, Vice President of Community Programs and Engagement here at the Aspen Institute. And I first want to thank Bob and Soledad Hurst for making this series possible. Thanks to our audience for tuning in for this important conversation. As I introduce our guests today, you'll find links to their bios in the chat, as well as other important information throughout the event. If you have questions for our speakers today, you can type those into the Q&A feature anytime during the event. Dr. Laurie Santos is Professor of Psychology and Head of Silliman College at Yale University. She is also director of the Comparative Cognition Laboratory and the Canine Cognition Center at Yale. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Biology and her PhD in Psychology from Harvard University. Carl Zimmer is an award-winning author of 13 books about science and is a professor adjunct at Yale University. His upcoming book, Life's Edge, is due out in March, and his column Matter appears each week in the New York Times. We are thrilled and honored to host you both today. Over to you, Carl. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to talk to Laurie, who I've talked to many a time. And I think, Laurie, I first started talking with you back when you were mainly, your life was mainly taken up with monkeys. You know, and how they have a sort of an economy the way we do, and so on. And then you started studying dogs. And I have a writing class at Yale, and you have generously for the past few years let me bring my students to your lab to actually do some reporting, watching you study how dogs think. But you know, we're going to talk today about something that, you know, a lot of people have gotten to know you for, more so than monkeys or dogs, I would say, happiness and well-being. You've been teaching a class at Yale on happiness, and also just doing a podcast. And maybe we could start the conversation just by I'm not even sure if I know if you've ever explained to me how you made this particular switch. Like where the whole happiness thing come from?
Yeah. Well, it makes sense in like when you're actually living the life to do the switch from monkeys to dogs to happiness, although it doesn't really seem like that. And that's one of the reasons this was fun. And I was so happy that you agreed to do this, is that I know we've talked a lot about the monkey work and the dog work, but not about the happiness stuff. So I'm excited to hear your hard questions about that stuff. I know those of you who don't know Carl's students, they're really go-getting young science journalists. So having them at the dog lab is always a bit of a blast. But yeah, so the switch to happiness happened when I took on a different role at Yale College. You know, as professors, we're all of these different roles, right? We're, you know, teachers in the classroom and we're researchers in our labs. But I took on this new role where I became a head of college on campus. So Yale is a funny school, kind of like Hogwarts, where there's like colleges within a college, you know, kind of like Gryffindor, Slytherin kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm head of Silliman College, which means I live on campus with students. And I kind of expected student life to be what I remember my student life to be back in the 90s when I was in college, and kind of what I saw in the classroom. But once I took this new role as a head of college, that like was not what I was seeing at all. I was just seeing like incredible amounts of like depression and anxiety. You know, even students who didn't have a clinical diagnosis were just kind of stressed all the time, and just had this feature where they felt like they were kind of fast forwarding their life. You know, it's like, how's it going? Like, well, I'm almost through midterms, or I'm almost up to the summer. And it just wasn't the kind of happy time I remembered from college. And so at first I started to worry, like, is this some weird feature of Yale? Or are you like, we causing a mental health crisis for our Ivy League students? But it turned out that nationally, you know, this kind of pattern wasn't just at Yale. Like, this was the kind of thing that we're seeing like all over the country, and in fact, all over the world. And the stats are pretty dire, right? So the most recent National College Health Assessment, which is from the data I have are from 2018, suggests that over 40% of college students nationally are too depressed to function. Over 60% report feeling overwhelming anxiety, and wow, over 10% have seriously considered suicide in the last year.
Do you think that's gone? Do you think that has gone up since you and I were in college, or was it always a mess? I mean, what
Yeah.
it's,
We
the
don't have
numbers are
great,
so
I haven't seen great data from when you and I are in college, but I think that speaks to our age rather than the statistics there. But they have gone up substantially just in the last 10 years. In fact, those rates of depression have doubled in just the last 9 years. And there's lots of features. I think these things are less stigmatized than they have been before. I think people talk in clinical diagnoses. Back when you and I were in college, we might have talked about kind of having butterflies in our stomach, and now people feel anxious or they feel depressed and so on. But
we just wore black.
We just wore black. Yeah, we were just goth in the 90s. But no, but even if you take into account these different terms that people use and the stigma and this kind of stuff, it's still skyrocketing up in these crazy ways. One of the mental health professionals at Yale who runs the mental health and counseling service suggests that if you look at the rise of rates of like diagnoses of things like depression and anxiety, they will stop in about 15 years, but that's because we'll be at 100% capacity of students using these services if the things are there, right? So it's pretty striking. And so that was where this switch to the happiness stuff came from, was that I just realized, like, we're kidding ourselves as educators if we think these students are perfectly learning biology and Chaucer and all the things we teach them, if 40% of them report being too depressed to function most days, and over 60% are saying they're overwhelmingly anxious. I just thought we needed to do something.
Right. Now, you're not a psychiatrist, you're not a clinical psychologist, you are sort of a cognitive psychologist, would you call yourself?
Yeah, I think even though I worked with monkeys, a lot of my training is on how people make decisions, how we can nudge behavior and things like that. And so I hadn't really done much work in this sort of field of what's called positive psychology, trying to look at the science of human flourishing. But, I'm like a psychologist. I was part of big grant panels with some of the big heavyweights in positive psychology. And so I kind of just did a quick retraining in some of that stuff, enough retraining to be able to teach an undergraduate course, which is what I was thinking. I thought, if we could give students a course where we taught them the science of this stuff, but also gave them opportunities to intervene in the way we know interventions seem to work, then maybe we would teach them some better habits. And so back in 2018, I designed this new class. It was like a new class at Yale. I thought 30 or so students would take it. You can imagine my surprise when over 1,000 students tried to enroll in the class. It became the largest class in Yale's history, which was surreal and involved lots of logistical problems that we don't need to get into. But I think it was cool because it showed me that, like, students were voting with their feet. Like, they also didn't like this culture of feeling overwhelmed and stressed and anxious, but they also wanted, like, an evidence-based approach to doing better, right? Like, I think they really, they didn't want to take a philosophy class on happiness or take a kind of class at the divinity school. I think they really wanted a scientific approach to kind of, like, what interventions work, what causes flourishing, what are we getting wrong? And it was cool to see so much student interest.
So how does a scientist study well-being, flourishing? Aside from, advice that your mom gives you, like, how can we approach this as scientists?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with a little ethnographic approach, I think, right? Which is that positive psychologists tend to go out first and find happy people, which feels like they're out there. Even during COVID, they're like happy people. You can track them down, right? And so the initial studies start by just literally looking at how happy people behave. What jobs do they have? Like, what do they exercise all the time? Are they religious? Like, how are they spending their lives, right? And then from there, you get hints about what happy people are doing that's different than the not so happy people. That's when you get to the experiments, right? So now you assign certain behaviors, certain interventions to the not so happy folks, and then you try to see if their well-being improves. Some caveats and some problems with this approach, right? One is that all those measures of happiness, like, how do we determine who's a happy person? It'd be wonderful to have, a little thermometer that you could stick in and it registers people's happiness. We don't have that. We just have self-report, which, from my old days in animal behavior, kind of feels like it sucks. I wish we had a better measure for this stuff. We don't. The good news is self-report correlates with all kinds of stuff that you would expect it to correlate with. And so it seems like it's both a valid measure and a pretty reliable one over time. Like, you can kind of track people's changes.
Right, but don't people say, like, I'm fine. Oh yeah, I'm perfectly happy. Yes, everything's great.
Well, you do it. You use slightly more rigorous measures. You try to have people, the two ways to do it are have people self-report on their emotions, right? So, tell me how often you've experienced these positive emotions over time. And another way is you have people self-report their life satisfaction. It's basically the answer to the question, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life? When you see these studies at first, it was hard for me to not think it was like a crappy like BuzzFeed quiz, as my students would talk about it. But actually, like they're pretty validated measures. So when you look at things like life satisfaction, it'll correlate with things like textual analyses of people's diaries. If you do some quick machine learning and pull out emotional words in people's diaries, it correlates with that stuff. It correlates with certain kinds of hormonal measures, but they're not perfect hormones correlated with this stuff. It correlates with family reports. So if I do detailed family interviews, it correlates.
So when you say it's validated, in other words, like there are these connections with other measurements that are strong enough and consistent enough, and you're like, well, there's something here. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. And so when we're trying to do a study, I think scientists take the shortcut rather than doing, detailed textual analysis of somebody's diary for the last 3 years. If I can just ask you, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life? And I get the same answer. It's like, use the quick and dirty method.
Right. What would you say is like the big thing we don't know about happiness?
I think there's a couple of things. Yeah. There's a lot we don't know about happiness, which is kind of frustrating being in the field trying to give people advice about it. I think one thing we don't know about happiness is why we're so bad at predicting what will make us happy. And this is one of the striking things. We talk about this a lot in the class and on my podcast. I use this phrase that our minds seem to lie to us about what makes us happy. And it's a little bit of a kind of catchy phrase, but basically what I mean is that there's so many things that we have this explicit assumption that if we go after this thing, if we get it, we will be happier. Think like money and material possessions, and for my students, perfect grades and accolades and things like that. And the data really just suggests that those things don't work in the way we think, right? Like they're just not as good as we think. The flip side is there's all this stuff that, tons of empirical evidence suggests if we focused on that, it really would improve our mood. It really would improve our life satisfaction. But we just don't have mechanisms to seek it out, which is really frustrating. Not entirely clear why that is. There's some interesting hints from neuroscience that just the way our brain is wired doesn't link those two things together very well. So we have these neural circuits for what you might call wanting, which is like craving stuff, right? Like the act of going out to get it, right? We also have neural circuits for liking, right? Like the actual reward you get when you get something. And those circuits dissociate in lots of funny ways. Like the worst case is like in addiction. So, if you're a heroin addict, for example, you have incredible craving, incredible wanting for this drug. Those systems are really active. But if you've been taking the drug for a while, once you get it, you're actually so habituated, you don't even get that much liking for it. And I feel like if we could just get these, if natural selection could have just put these circuits together, we would have had a much easier time like seeking out things that really give us joy.
Apparently evolution doesn't actually care about our happiness all that much.
Well, this is another interesting thing is like, it probably doesn't, I don't think natural selection wanted us to be happy. Like it wanted us to like keep striving for stuff, right? Like it probably never wanted us to be satisfied. And so kind of what joy and those positive emotions are there for is actually kind of an interesting, there's lots of interesting evolutionary questions about happiness.
Right. You mentioned your podcast. So, you've been sort of branching out into other ways of sharing the science.
Yeah, which has been really, really fun. So, the class went much more viral on campus than I expected. But another thing that was unexpected was the response in the public about the Yale class. We very soon into teaching the class, I had a New York Times article about the class, which the point of which seemed to be, all these Yale students, 1 out of every 4 Yale students at Yale wants to take a class about happiness. But what about the rest of us? We're not 19 in an Ivy League institution. We need this stuff too. And so that caused me to realize that, it's not just Yale students who aren't flourishing as much as they could. A lot of us need these sorts of tips. And so we put the class online on Coursera.org completely for free, a sort of shorter version of the class. But I got lots of emails after that saying, I'm stressed and overwhelmed. I don't have time to take a whole Yale class. Like, give me like a shorter version. And so the next step was to try to put this content into a podcast version, which was for a couple of reasons. One is so people could get these tips in little, bite-sized half-hour episodes, but also because the podcast is such a cool format for giving more narrative explanations of some of the scientific findings, right? Like I can interview people who are putting the science into practice, and you can really see it kind of playing out in people's lives. And so that's been super fun too.
Yeah, and so now we're in this gigantic psychology experiment where we're all dealing with the pandemic, and which is a huge challenge on our happiness and well-being. You're how are you holding up?
I'm okay. It's been a lot. But yeah, I think one nice thing about having taught all this stuff and sort of retraining in this stuff is that I do know habits that kind of work for boosting your mood and your well-being. And those habits work, in normal times, but they also work during COVID-19 too.
How would you I mean, from your perspective, looking, thinking about our happiness and well-being, what is this pandemic like, do you think? I mean, what effect is it having psychologically on us, beyond what our sort of normal day-to-day struggles with happiness and sadness are?
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID-19 was designed by natural selection to just spread in the population and get itself, copied as much as possible. But if you're looking from a happiness perspective, it feels like it was designed to really like take a huge hit on our mental health, right? For a couple reasons. I mean, one is the very way that COVID-19 spreads forces us to like socially distance. It forces us to not engage in the one thing that we as social primates need to feel better generally, but especially in times of crisis. So if you look at other times of crisis for people, like periods of war, after a horrible hurricane or something like that, what people do to process trauma is to come together, right? They come together with the people they care about. They come together in community settings. They try to help one another. This virus is insidious because the one thing that we want to do when we're feeling yucky, we really can't do in the same way. The other thing is that the source of solace typically is other people, but this virus makes the other people a source of threat, right? Like the people I would normally go to, it's not just that I can't do that, it's that the act of seeing them, I have to worry if they're going to give me this virus, right? So our main way of coping, we can't do in the same way right now during this virus. Plus, the virus is hitting at deep existential concerns for all of us, right? Like life and death, right? This is a virus that's killing people who are not typically, like going to catch a respiratory virus and die in a way that's kind of shocking and really scary. I think it's like throwing our economies into uncertainty. It's throwing our daily life into uncertainty. And I think the worst thing is like, we just don't have a sense of how long this is going to last. I check in with your awesome vaccine tracker. Anyone that doesn't know, Carl has a wonderful vaccine tracker where you can see, how the progress is going towards getting a vaccine. But I don't know how many days that tracker is going to be up till we all get one, right? And no one can really say. And so I think that's a particularly scary thing, is we don't know how long this is going to last. I think some of us, when we first started, in lockdown or social distancing, thought like, all right, I could do this for a week. I'm gonna bake some bread and like play board games with my kids and whatever. But in like month 3 or 4, like it's starting to feel like, when is this gonna be over? And so our minds just really don't like uncertainty. We are an incredibly uncertainty averse primate. And this virus just has such tremendous uncertainty about our daily life and when we can get back to going to restaurants and things, what's going to happen with our job, what's going to happen with our family. All those things are huge hits on our well-being.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it's interesting. I was thinking about this virus, and as we're starting to get to know it better, I mean, in a way, it's like it's even more evolved to hit those things you were talking about, because initially, like, people thought, well, this is maybe like SARS, which hit in the early 2000s. And with SARS, as a respiratory disease where like you got infected and then you just got really sick really fast, and then you became infectious. You would cough up and get people sick around you. Whereas now what's pretty clear is like maybe 30% of people, roughly speaking, maybe more, never show symptoms. And even if you do show symptoms, you're actually more infectious in the run up to actually when you're really starting to have that hacking cough. So I wonder how you think that sort of plays in to this anxiety you're talking about, when it's like you or I could be infected right now and neither of us would know it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that plays out. I mean, people generally are good and want to help one another and don't want to cause harm, right? And I think that's another feature of the uncertainty is like, I don't know right now if I have it and I could be causing harm, right? And I think that kind of freaks people out. I mean, tons of conversations with my friends who want to, go see elderly relatives or go to this thing. And I think there's both the fear that you might catch it, but also the fear that you could be the person that's spreading it, which is really kind of scary. You talk to people. I did a conversation with the folks at the synagogue in New York, where there's that sort of super spreader event early on in New York City.
Right.
And it's just awful to be the person that spread that without knowing it, right? And so I think it's both this kind of fear that you could get it, but the fear of harming one another too. And if we know anything from moral psychology, we know most people, kind of non-psychopaths, really want to work not to harm other people. Some lovely studies by my colleague at Yale, Molly Crockett, that shows that people will require more money to get paid to shock someone else than they have to get paid to shock themselves. So you take, say like $10 to shock yourself, but just shock somebody else, you're going to get paid $20, right? Like we really don't like harming other people. And I think that's another feature of this virus that like, we just don't want to be the cause of harm, but this virus might completely inadvertently cause us to do that.
So what about I'm sort of curious what you think of the psychology of masks. Like, I mean, for me, like masks were just this sort of like basic epidemiology thing and study, I would like look at what physicists had to say. Well, how well does this mask work? What happens with droplets this size? And now I'm realizing like there's a whole psychology to masks, people who are like yelling because other people want them to wear a mask, or people yelling at other people because they're not wearing a mask, or people are now claiming that somehow you can run out of oxygen by wearing a mask, which I mean must be amazing to like brain surgeons who work for 8 hours at a shot with a mask on. I mean, what's your idea as a psychologist? How do you look at this whole mask phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's been completely fascinating because it's played into so many issues that psychologists study, not even in the context of happiness research, but just generally, right? So one of the spots where I think masks have gotten really interesting is that for whatever reason, they've become an incredibly partisan issue. Like they're almost a signal of which party you're probably going to vote for in November, which I don't think is inherent to masks. It just kind of played out in the context of who was using masks, who tended to use them. I think you had, a powerful partisan figure on one side who kind of wasn't using them, and that became its own signal. And so what you're finding is that masks end up being a marker for our group status. And we know that we are a deeply groupy, deeply tribal species where we care a lot about affiliating with our own party and kind of avoiding what the out group is doing and kind of signaling that quite strongly. And so, for whatever reason, these masks played into our groupiness in the same way that like wearing a Red Sox t-shirt or wearing a Yankees t-shirt would do, right? And I think that's part of the problem we're seeing at accepting them is that, for a decent, half-ish of the population, this might not be signaling their in-group status in the way that you think. It'd be interesting to see how that changed around now that President Trump is very publicly worn some masks and sort of had that switch around a bit. But so I think that's been really interesting. I think it's also a case where we are watching this play out in just norms in general, right? Like of how you wear it and what's appropriate to do.
Right.
I think, we all have kind of questions about this is like, what's the norm? If I'm walking down the street and somebody's not wearing a mask, should I say something? Is that the normative thing to do? Or does that make me a jerk? Is that like a good thing to do? Not just like morally responsible to do, but maybe morally obliged to do to tell somebody to do it? Do you tell, the people who are wearing the like nose mask, like, are you obliged to tell them to pull it up? Because that's not right. These are kinds of moral negotiations that we navigate in other contexts, right? But we haven't had to do them in the context of this crisis. And so, and then I think people, we haven't had a history of wearing masks in this country. And so I think we just haven't really learned a lot about how they work and what, why they're so good and why they're so powerful. I think it doesn't help that the recommendations weren't so clear from the beginning, we don't need masks and now, don't take them and we need to keep them for healthcare personnel. It's like everybody needs one right now. And so it's been this wonderful little microcosm to watch so many features of human psychology from the way we set norms to how we identify with groups play out. The sad thing is like none of those features of human psychology are helping people for the most part, like stick on a mask and just wear it to protect everyone. And so part of it is like conversations about how we can harness those features of psychology to maybe get people to do better.
I mean, I would imagine, tying it back again to sort of well-being, that like, if we're, I mean, we're under this big stress of dealing with the pandemic. And I would imagine that, if we could sort of bring together, have a sort of a sense of a united cause, and that we're doing things together, then that might help a bit. And instead, sometimes people are just, in conflict, and I don't know. I mean, I wonder how much social media. I mean, we're at home and we're on Instagram or Twitter, to pass the time, and people are tweeting like, "Oh, look at this idiot," or "You're being a fool," or what. It just sort of feels like, even though we're isolated, there's still a lot of sniping at each other, which can't help.
Yeah, and I think that's something, I think that's been true both in the news media generally, but definitely in our social media feeds, right? Is that what gets people's attention is the violations, right? Like when people are doing bad stuff. In the beginning of this crisis, there were tons of news stories and like tons of things in my Twitter feed about, look at this, those people like hoarding toilet paper, or selling hand sanitizer at horrible rates. Like, we have this negativity bias, so our attention tends to go to the negative stuff, right? And that's what sells newspapers. Like people are like, queuing up and buying only the toilet paper they need doesn't like sell copy, right? But like, oh my gosh, everyone's so evil, right? And so I think there's a tendency for us to like attend to and see that more often, much more so than I think it actually reflects the real statistics that are out there. I think this is kind of a problem generally in like human psychology, which is that the stuff that we tend to see on social media might not be representative of people's real views. So for every kind of crazy person screaming at someone about not wearing a mask that I see in my feed, there's probably lots of sane people, even from like different political groups, that are wearing their masks and kind of doing their thing. And so I have colleagues who've been on campaigns to like reset norms by like, posting like, went to the grocery store, everyone had a mask, nobody was freaking out, it's totally fine, and it sounds silly, but it's actually important. There's data suggesting that we have minds that confuse what's called descriptive norms versus prescriptive norms. What do I mean by that? Well, a descriptive norm is just like, what are people doing? How many people are wearing a mask, right? It turns out that our minds soak up descriptive norms as though they're prescriptive. So when we see other people doing a lot of stuff, we think, oh, that's what we're supposed to be doing too. So if we see a bunch of people hoarding toilet paper and not wearing masks and freaking out, like, we're going to end up inadvertently copying those things, the data really suggest. And so I think it actually behooves us to give more accurate representations of what's really going on, and to kind of like bring up these positive stories of people kind of doing what they're supposed to do, because the data really suggests that inadvertently will actually change people's behavior. If we had more stories showing like, hey, a lot of Trump supporters are wearing masks and they're doing their thing, that would actually affect Trump voters and make them maybe wear masks even more often.
And I mean, we're talking about sort of the psychology in a situation where our physical health is being threatened, and in a way, like, that psychology influences our physical health, right? I mean, if the way we are feeling psychologically is going to affect our bodies, which are, we're worried about getting infected with viruses. What have you learned about sort of like well-being in terms of the effect that it can have on our health, our physical health?
Yeah, I mean, a couple threads on that. So one is just what the data really suggest about well-being and health, right? I mean, I think often we think, if we get the right circumstances, if we're generally healthy, then we'll be happy, right? The data actually suggests that in some cases we might have the causal arrow backwards, that there's evidence to suggest that things like positive mood, things like satisfaction with life and so on, can actually have a protective effect on our health. One famous study that was done with nuns back in the day actually looked at longevity in nuns and tried to see how happiness predicted that. Why did they pick nuns? Well, first of all, it was just a convenient sample, but more nuns kind of have limited risk factors because they're kind of all, doing pretty safe things, not like riding nun motorcycles or bungee jumping and stuff like that. And so what researchers did was they got nuns' diaries from back when they were in their 20s and they first, started life as a nun. And they did these kind of textual analyses to pull out positive words, like how positive are you in your diaries? Are you, oh my gosh, I'm so thrilled to find meaning in life? Or are you just kind of describing your day? What they find is that the happy words that nuns used in their 20s actually predicted which nuns lived into their 70s and which nuns lived into their 90s, which is pretty incredible that you can get such a predictive effect for things like longevity. There's also evidence that things like positive mood can actually affect like immune function. One study took measures, these kind of self-report measures of people's positive style, and actually infected people with rhinoviruses. They like shot this little nasal spray of rhinoviruses in. And you find you get the people who have the lowest positive styles, the people who are kind of most negative, end up catching colds about twice as often as the people with the positive style, right? And so these, again, that's not to say we shouldn't wash our hands, we shouldn't do the right stuff, but one factor in the mix might actually be our positive outlook in ways that we don't actually expect. And so,
but can you, I mean, how good is the science on that arrow of cause and effect? I mean, in the sense that like, I could imagine that if I work on making myself a happier person, that could have some effect on, my immune system. Or I could imagine that, I just happen to be lucky and, inherit genes or have a microbiome or whatever existing from the start that both leads me to be kind of a happy person and to live long. And there's really there's no point in me trying to be happier because it is what the die is cast. So
yeah.
How clear is the causation there?
Yeah, there's studies that look in the right causal direction, like the nun study. So for example, you're studying happiness at time 1 in your 20s, and you're trying to see how it predicts later. Not as many great studies where you do the intervention, right? So you take nuns and you force them in their 20s, like, look, be happy, be happy. You do interventions to make them be happy, and then you see if that transitions when they're in their 90s. But there's still hints, I think, that there is, as you mentioned, a kind of correlation between what's happening in terms of our well-being and what's happening in terms of our bodies, right? Like, just take the kind of threat that we're all facing right now, right? Like, how does that manifest when we're kind of freaked out about our job or scared about our elderly relatives, or we get mail and we're like, oh crap, did I wash my hands when I picked up the mail? Like, all of those moments are our minds detecting threat. And our body has a very specific reaction when we detect threat, right? We go into kind of fight or flight mode. This is the activation of our sympathetic nervous system, right? And what that does is our brain think there's a tiger that's going to attack us. So we shut off all the available systems for digestion and sexual health and good sleep and all that stuff. That stuff gets shut off while we try to deal with the threat. I mean, these systems were built for literal tigers jumping out at us, or predator, not tigers per se, but the kind of stuff that would get us back in the evolutionary day. It wasn't built for, a freaky virus that was going to go on for months and months and months. And so we're kind of constantly upregulating this fight or flight system in a way that's, causing us to mess with our digestive health and mess with all the normal functioning of our bodies.
And also, I don't face, tiger attacks in this small New England town, hardly ever. But, the other day, a few weeks ago, I lost all track of time, but I thought I'm going to venture back into my very favorite coffee shop just to go and buy some coffee, because I love their coffee. And they were opened, they were real good. They had the plexiglass up, they had masks on. And I was like, I can get in and get out and it'll be fine, no big deal. And I go in there and I have to turns out I have to wait a little bit. This is the most charming coffee shop ever. You have to come see it when normal times return. Anyway, so there I am, no tigers, just a regular coffee shop. And there are people there who waiting for to get a sandwich. I'm like, why are you here? I don't understand when someone wants to go out to get a sandwich, but there they are. And they're wandering around and coming to me to want to chit chat, coming right at me.
And you're like, dude.
Yeah, right. I am like, whoa, I'm literally putting my hands out to a perfectly nice person who just wants to be right up close to me to chat about where they get some of their produce. And it was so stressful. I mean, I came out of there, my wife just thought that I had been to a war or something, and I was just trying to get some coffee. And I imagine that, like, that must be like a strange sort of addition to all the other kinds of stress that we're dealing with. Just these ordinary situations are now suddenly like, oh, this could put me on a ventilator.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think, it's the disconnect that I think really freaks our mind out between what we did before. Like, I mean, I've had the same experience. There's the coffee shop I used to go to all the time. It's now back open. It's kind of doing curbside stuff. And, I go there and you talk to the barista, and this is someone I would chit chat with the whole time, right? And I see them, like type something in and move their mask, and I'm like, like, this person's gonna kill me, So I think it's this kind of, it's not just that it's a threat, but it's a threat in context that used to feel safe. And I think that's the particularly scary thing, is like, what if I can't just go to like my local coffee shop and get a coffee and that's a smooth sailing? Like, what else is really stressful? I mean, even, take things that used to be specifically safe, right? Like going to the doctors, like going to the dentist. My husband just went to the dentist and we had this like long discussion,
Wow.
like, should we go to the dentist? And it's like, it's the dentist. Like, it should be the thing that helps you get healthy. And so we're constantly running our fight or flight system, including for events that used to be perfectly safe. And that has a huge toll on our physical health. Like, these are the kinds of, there's a wonderful book by a Stanford neuroscientist, Bob Sapolsky, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, where he really makes the strong case that a lot of the problems of modern day, things like heart disease and cancer and like screw ups of your microbiome and stuff, are in part because we're like constantly running this fight or flight system. And it's not clear when we're going to shut it off.
And I mean, wrapped up in the basic, pandemic, and dealing with a virus, we're also dealing with what's going to be a huge long-term impact of this virus, which is like that our economy is shredded. And I mean, I imagine there must be like a huge amount of research on, how losing your job, how your parents becoming unemployed, how losing your house can wreck your sense of well-being. I mean, what's your feeling about this? I mean, we're practically in a Great Depression. What's that going to do?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. There's lots of data suggesting that obviously it's not so much. So the research on kind of money and happiness suggests that money affects your happiness when you don't have enough to kind of make ends meet and live. It also affects your happiness when you go from like point A that's over here to like point B that's down here. Even if you're not kind of below the poverty line, kind of changes in the negative direction we notice and have a huge effect on our well-being. And so I think both of these kinds of things are happening to people in their daily life. Plus, you have to think about kind of what goes with that. Right? It's not even in some cases is unemployment just about the money and just about your access to resources. It's about a sense of meaning, right? It's about the stability of a job you thought was going to be there, right? It's about just kind of the philosophy of, are these institutions going to last, right? In a way that we thought they were going to last, right? These things that we kind of just took for granted. And so I think all of those, in addition to kind of the monetary changes, in addition, those kind of changes to meaning and a sense of purpose and just kind of how you're spending your time can really be profound hits on our well-being too.
So we have a few minutes left before we're going to take people's questions. So if viewers want to put questions in, please leave them, and the moderator will be checking them out. But before we get there, I'm not going to ask you to pull the country out of a Great Depression, and I'm not asking you to personally invent a vaccine to end the pandemic, but maybe like you could offer some suggestions for how we can at least manage, our emotional situation in the middle of, something that hasn't happened in a century, really. Like what does your understanding of the science tell you about things that people might want to do to just to get through the day sometimes?
Yeah. And I think I like the way you framed it, just kind of get through the day, because I think in a lot of sense, that's what we have to do, right? Like what we need to do is kind of use these tiny interventions to feel a little bit of joy, to kind of shut off our fight or flight system when we have the opportunity to do it. We're not going to solve the crisis. Hopefully some epidemiologists and vaccine researchers are working very hard on that. I'm not going to do that.
They're working on it.
But in the meantime, there's actually a lot we can do. And so what do you do? So one important thing I think is to try to patch up all the things we talked about before in terms of our social connection, right? Like this virus seems like it's out there to break up our social connection. It's kind of one of the things it's doing really well. We need to fight against that. And we can, right? I mean, we can use technologies like you and I are doing right now, right? To kind of chat over Zoom and things like that. And the good news is the data suggests it's pretty good to do that. It's obviously not as good as like, if I were to be able to go to my mom's house and give her a hug, like you don't have touch, you don't have that stuff. But in real time connection, where we're kind of talking in real time and you can kind of hear my vocal expressions and see subtle things about my facial movements and stuff like that, turns out that's pretty good. What's not as good is like texting or stuff like that. Like the not in real time stuff doesn't work so well, but in real time works pretty good. We just have to be more intentional about it, right? Because we're not running into people in the coffee shop in the same way anymore. If we are, it's going to cause us more stress, as you mentioned. Right. And that means, you gotta like schedule stuff, right? Schedule those Zoom happy hours or like a Zoom exercise session with friends, or just like pick up the old fashioned phone and like call an elderly neighbor. It does take a little bit more work, but the benefits are pretty huge. I think one caveat I'll give to that is, a lot of us are kind of experiencing a little bit of the Zoom fatigue now that we've been in this for a long time.
Yeah. Why do you, I will sometimes like after being on Zoom for half an hour or something, I will just be wiped out. And I'm like, I don't get it. Like, it's almost like there's something kind of fogging my head. And I don't understand why that happens.
Yeah, there's a couple hints that you get from the attentional research. One is that, especially in big Zoom meetings, multiple people are talking at once. And we usually kind of can saccade between people. We usually don't like take in all the really close facial expressions all at once. So it's kind of cognitively exhausting. Another thing that's super cognitively exhausting is watching yourself. So an easy thing you can do, the data suggests, to be less Zoom exhausted is to shut yourself off. Because when you see yourself, you're like, oh, my hair, and like you get all these self-presentational goals, and did I say that, my background? Like that's just kind of, we don't do that as normal primates, right? So shutting your self-view off can be really powerful. But part of the tips I give to people is that, we're going to need different things at different times in this pandemic. And one of the kind of general tips I have for kind of feeling better is trying to be a little mindful about what's working and what's not. I use the analogy of food sometimes just because it makes sense. Like what's going to feel like a nutritious social connection for you? And that's going to vary. Sometimes you need the big group Zoom where everybody's having a glass of wine and it feels like, you're at a pub or something. Sometimes you just need the like one-on-one with your mom, right? Like what's going to feel nutritious is going to be different. I think paying attention after an interaction, hey, did that feel depleting or did that feel kind of nice? Those things can be useful techniques to figure out what you want to do next. Because again, as we said before, there's this disconnect between what you're going to like and what you're going to want. And so you kind of have to do some work to figure out what that is. So that's social connection. But just before we jump to questions, another, I think, really powerful one is that, we can't control the threat that's out there necessarily, but we can control our body's reaction to it. It turns out there's one way to hack that fight or flight reaction that your body has, which is through your breath, which didn't need to be the case. It's just like our our autonomic nervous system is just kind of wired up like this, that the act of taking a really slow, deep belly breath over time, like really slow, deep into the belly, and then out, really long exhale. It turns out that activates the vagus nerve in a way that turns on the other non-fight or flight systems, this rest and digest system, our parasympathetic nervous system.
The vagus nerve is something that runs up like from the stomach, right? Is it? Oh, like all the way up through the body?
Yeah, and really what you're doing is, I think that the way I've kind of framed it evolutionarily is like, if a tiger was really attacking me right now and I was sprinting away, I couldn't take a really slow, 5 really slow deep belly breaths, right? And so when you force yourself to do that, your body's like, hang on, this threat can't be that bad right now. All right, chill out. Like, so it's like a kind of explicit conscious way to like rig the system. Right. And so it sounds super silly. And again, it almost sounds pedantic if you're freaking out, somebody's like, just take a deep breath. It feels like you're going to get more pissed off at that person. But I think there's biological reality to that, which is that actually the act of taking a couple slow, deep belly breaths is just a moment where you can turn on this rest and digest system. And so I've actually been forcing myself to do that. I actually do that kind of in between Zoom meetings now, just like, all right, that Zoom meeting shut off. I'm about to turn the other one on before you click like, enter room or click video. just 3, and it can actually be really powerful. And so those are, we can talk maybe about some more tips during the questions, but those are just 2 quick ones that you really can take action on at any time to feel a little bit better.
Cool. All right, great. Yeah, well, so why don't we, maybe we can hear some of the questions.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of great questions coming in. The first one is, what are some of the ways our brains lie to us that keep us from being happy? And what are some of the habits we can incorporate into our daily lives to thwart these tricks, to thwart these tricks our minds play on us?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, this is why we need my podcast and my class. Like, there are a lot of ways our minds lie to us about happiness in kind of both directions, right? This idea that there's certain things we can seek out that are just going to work for happiness. And then we kind of put energy into those, but then they're not kind of working in the way we think. And lots of cases where we just don't have mechanisms to crave or seek stuff out. But like, if we actually sought that stuff out, we'd feel a lot better. And so, just go through the list of stuff that people crave, right? Like money, like, accolades, like, just like joy, like lots of sugary, fattening food and French fries and things, right? Like, definitely when I get stressed in this pandemic, I want Carb City, right? Like, all those things we kind of crave, but they don't actually give us the long-standing hit we want. Versus, taking a really hard yoga class, or like, making that like hard call and like scheduling a time with my mom to like talk with her, doing nice things for others, taking that belly breath. Like, I don't have mechanisms that cause me to crave those things, but the data really suggests if I engage with them, that I'll actually feel a lot better. And so this is kind of the disconnect. And this is why I think we really need the science, is like, our brains, what it's telling us to go after isn't going to work. I see this so hugely in the context of my leisure right now, especially after the long day of Zoom. I'm just like, I feel dead. What I'm craving is like to plop down and just like do something totally mindless and watch Netflix. And then I do that for 2 hours. And then if I ask like, how nutritious did that feel? I'm like, that didn't feel nutritious at all. I feel gross and kind of nasty, right? Whereas if I like went for a run, or like put the work in to like schedule a good call with somebody, or even just like took time to meditate, right? Like, I'd feel so much better. And so I think this is where we need to fight the disconnect of our minds, is like, our minds are telling us to do stuff that we think is going to work, but it's not going to work in the way we think. So it's not like we're not trying, we're trying, but just like doing it in the wrong way.
Our next question is, what is the role of environment in shaping our happiness? In other words, how does place influence our happiness?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to answer that question. One is like, how does our environment shape happiness generally? Like, not just place, but kind of, the circumstances we live in and so on. And the data there are, if your circumstances, if your place is such that it's like traumatic, right? If you're not physically safe, you can't put food on the table or those kinds of things, that's definitely going to affect your happiness a lot. But assuming the people who are listening to this aren't in those categories, for the most part, our circumstances don't affect our happiness as much as we think, right? Our circumstances are always the things we want to change, and they do have some effect on our happiness, but it's the magnitude of the effect on our happiness is less than we think, and the length of time that it affects our happiness is less than we think. And so on both of those counts, we kind of mispredict. So I think that our circumstances just aren't affecting our happiness as much as we suspect. But now what about place? You're talking about like a little local place. And I think, if you're thinking about place in terms of the kinds of things that you bring into your attentional system, the kinds of things that you mindfully notice, then place in some sense affects our happiness a lot, right? If you're in a space where you're kind of mindfully being present and noticing the things around you, from like the smiles that are out there to the trees to all this stuff, the data really suggests that that act of presence, like being mindful and being present, can have a profound increasing effect on your own well-being. So much so that just taking these mindful pauses to notice things like what you're eating, the sort of active mindful eating, or to notice your surroundings. If you're going on a walk, what does the air feel like? What do the trees look like? What colors are you seeing? Just those moments of being present in your place can actually affect your happiness a lot. And so my read of the data is that it's not specifically where you are, but it's your kind of mindset of how you're noticing it.
Mm-hmm. Our next question is, what 3 things would you suggest to improve well-being?
Well, I mean, we mentioned a couple of them already. I think social connection is a really huge one. My read is every available survey of happy people suggests that happy people are more social. Like the correlation is just huge. And we know that loneliness can have a huge impact, a huge negative impact on our well-being, right? So be a little bit more social and be intentional about being social, especially right now. The other two are ones that we haven't hit on just yet. So another one is that, and this is a kind of big misnomer too. I think right now a lot of us are talking about self-care and treat yourself and do nice things for yourself. And it's not so much that self-care is bad. It's just that often self-care comes at an opportunity cost of doing nice stuff for others. And another incredibly robust data point in all the work on happiness is that people who volunteer, people who do nice stuff for others, people who are other oriented, so thinking about other people's happiness in addition to their own, they tend to be happier than the ones that don't. And here we have some lovely intervention studies where you like force people to do nice stuff for others. You like give people money and you say, spend that money on someone else. What you find is that they're happier at the end of the day than someone who had the same amount of money who spent it on themselves. And so a second thing to do to be happier is when you get in kind of self, me kind of space, what can you do to branch that out and do something for other people?
Is there a challenge? I mean, is there that some people might see that as kind of a challenge in the middle of a pandemic when we're literally like the way to help people is just to stay away from other people. So how, I mean, do you have kind of like, a pandemic version of that advice?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just, as you're reflecting on what a pain in the butt the mask is, just to reflect on that, like, when I'm putting this on, I'm going to help the people around me, right? Sometimes our happiness is really about how we frame things, and even framing something not as self-care, but as other care can be really powerful. But another pandemic version is like many, not all of us. I mean, some people are in really awful financial straits, but some folks are having like little mini financial windfalls. We were just talking about not going to a coffee shop that we go to, in my case, every day for months and months. For me, that's like $2 to $3 a day that I'm saving. Like, what could I do with that to help someone else? Maybe even give it back to the coffee shop, right? Like donate it to someone who's in need, right? Those of us who don't have little financial windfalls are getting little temporal windfalls. We're not commuting to work, right? It's 10 minutes, but maybe I could, call my congressman and, like use that 10 minutes to advocate for an issue I really care about, or spend that 10 minutes calling an elderly neighbor that I haven't talked to in a while. So the pandemic version is like baby steps, but really recognize that you're having these tiny windfalls that you could spend in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was 2, you asked for 3. So I think that the third one I think I would focus on is kind of a mindset one, which is that the data suggests that people who have a mindset of gratitude tend to be happier than people who kind of have a mindset for griping. And this is one I struggle with. I'm not naturally a grateful person at all. Even before the call, Carl and I were talking and I was griping about various things about my own COVID situation, right? But that's not what happy people do. Happy people spontaneously bring to mind all the blessings. And here again, you can intervene. You can kind of just force yourself to move your attention more towards the stuff that you are grateful for. And it turns out that that will make you happier. And I think this is one that feels really salient to me in the pandemic, right? Every morning, for years when I walked into that coffee shop, I didn't think, this is amazing. I'm so grateful that I get this latte and I get to talk to these people in the morning. Every time I walked into a grocery store, I didn't think, this is so grateful that I just get to like walk around and pick up fruit without a mask or worrying if somebody sneezed on this like can of like soup or something, right? I think we're all realizing that there were so many individual things in our lives that we absolutely took for granted before, that hopefully when we get out of this crisis, we won't. Hopefully we'll start, when I finally get to like see my mom, who I haven't seen in a while because she has COPD and she's immunocompromised, like when I finally get to see her in person and give her a hug, I think that's going to be a like really gratitude filled hug in a way that it hadn't been before. And so I think that's a powerful one to realize during this crisis.
I mean, people may sometimes though feel guilty if they stop to sort of feel grateful about something good in their life at a time when just there's so much suffering.
Yeah. And I think that this is actually a question I get a lot is it okay to be joyful in the context of this crisis, right? Like, is that like morally appropriate? And I think, for a couple reasons it is. One is, gets back to these data that we talked about before, right? That there might be some connection between your positive mood and lots of features of your healthy behavior in terms of your physical health, right? Like, if you're constantly just focused on the threats, you're running your fight or flight system. And that's, all things considered, that's not going to be great if you get exposed to COVID virus and stuff like that, right? So it's like protecting your own physical health and so on. But it also can have effect on other people. We're such social primates that we have enormous ways of catching other people's emotions, right? Go on your social media feed and read a couple negative posts and see how gross you feel, nasty you feel afterwards, versus even a couple, happy cat memes can kind of put you in the like, oh, that was sort of funny, right? Like, we're constantly catching other people's emotions. And so I think your act of kind of feeling joy or feeling grateful can actually transmit to other people who might not have the bandwidth to feel that gratitude themselves given their circumstances, but just your emotions can be catchy and positive for them. So I get totally the guilt thing. It feels like maybe we should not have any joy, but I think ultimately we need to kind of embrace joy where we can, especially in these kind of hard times.
Our next question is, I've read that you should spend your money on experiences rather than on stuff. Why is that? And can you give an example of it in practical terms?
Yeah, so this is another really robust finding. And I think another thing we get wrong, we think, material possession, if I buy a nice new car, a nice jacket, like that's going to stick around for a long time. That's a good investment, right? It's going to make me feel happier. But the data actually suggests just the opposite. Things that stick around are things that we get used to. Why wasn't I joyous every time I walked into that coffee shop? It was because I get to do it every day. Why am I not joyous every time I pick up my miracle of an iPhone? Because it's been around for a while. I've kind of gotten bored with it. Experiences, in contrast, don't have that feature. They tend not to last very long, especially with my income. The experiences I buy that are awesome are like kind of short-lived, my vacations and things like that. But that's a good feature because it means they don't last long enough for us to get used to them. A second feature of experiences that seem to make them better than material possessions is that they connect us with other people. Like, we often do experiences with other people, but even when we do experiences solo, it like gives us something to talk about to other people. If I were to start telling Carl about like my last vacation and how it was, like we could have an interesting conversation about that. But if I started telling Carl about like the latest pair of shoes I bought, like he'd probably get bored really fast. And there's evidence to suggest that when you talk about your material possessions, people kind of think you're a jerk. And so experiences also do this interesting thing where they connect us with other people in a way that material possessions don't. Now, I think implicit in that question might be, this is another thing we're taking a hit on. Those of us who get joy out of our experiences, going to a live concert, going on vacation, and so on, like we're not doing that as much right now. But another nice feature of our psychology is that it turns out, as much joy out of having the experience as we also do out of anticipating the experience. So people who like buy a vacation in advance or purchase concert ticket in advance, you kind of get excited and you get utility and reward out of thinking about what that's going to be like. It's why people like read, restaurant reviews and this kind of thing ahead of time. And so this is what I've been comforting myself with, is even if I'm not going to like take a vacation home, I'm like going on Airbnb of like, when things are better, this is the place I'm going to, and it's going to be awesome. And it feels silly that should work, but the data suggests it actually can.
Right.
Fill up that 2022 calendar.
Exactly. 2023 is going to be a mad vacation year for all of us.
Our last question is, in the big picture, do you think this pandemic will bring about a great reset in psychological terms to our ways of life, our priorities, our relationships with others, and with nature?
Yeah, I'm actually really hopeful about this for a couple of reasons. One is that the term post-traumatic stress gets a lot of airtime of like PTSD and things like that. But if you look in the psychology literature, there's also a lot of evidence for what's called PTG, or is a post-traumatic growth, right? What you find is that after crises, especially after collective crises, a few things often happen to people. One is that they start to really appreciate what matters most in life. They tend to derive a lot of purpose and meaning. They tend, especially when going through collective crises, to form deeper, richer social connections with people. And they also tend to kind of feel a little bit more resilient after. If you go through something really crappy, everything that's not as crappy as that doesn't feel as bad anymore. And I feel like we as a world are going through this awful, awful crisis that might lead on the other side to a little bit more post-traumatic growth than we appreciate. And I think that that can be really powerful. No one would pick a trauma, especially a trauma like this, to go through to kind of feel a little bit more resilient on the other side, of course, but it could actually have some positive effects. That's in terms of our psychology. But I think in terms of other stuff, I think we're going to appreciate things in a different way. I think it's already causing these moments of a societal pause that's causing us to ask, like, do we really need to be traveling this much, right? Like, do we really need to be commuting in this way before? Do we really need to be expending resources in this way? It's not clear how all those answers are going to come out, but that moment of pause and like taking time to reflect on these things, I think as a big society, is definitely going to cause us to come out with better answers on the other side. So I think both in terms of our own private psychologies and our own collective well-being and the planet's well-being, this awful, awful event might have more bright sides than we think.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Santos. Thank you, Carl. Thanks to our audience for tuning in. Thanks for all the great questions. All of our community events this summer are free and open to the public. And so if you are in a position to donate, please click on the link in the chat. Please join us for the rest of our summer of events. Our next event is on Monday, July 20th, featuring George Will and Susan Page. Thanks for joining us.